Welcome everyone to Journeys Through the Books of the Prophets. Tonight we start a brand new book, the book of 1 Kings, the book of Melachim. And there are two, it's usually broken into two books, 1 and 2 Melachim. So we'll be on this for quite a while. And of course, there are so many interesting stories and what to learn. So here we go. So right at the beginning, we finished the book of Shmuel with towards the end of King David's life. And the last few classes that we did, everyone can go to our channel on YouTube or if they're on Telegram and get all the old videos that we did a whole review of David's life, his influence, the essence of his soul. And I mentioned then, though, that we begin the book of Melachim and David is still alive. But here we see in the opening chapters is when David passes away and how the kingship was passed on to his son Shlomo, Solomon. So it begins by saying that David was old, advanced in years. It's the same language used by Avram. Here it says, "V'hamelech David zaken ba b'yamim." And the same thing is said about Avram. Avram zaken ba b'yamim. He was elderly, and he came into days. But we know he was 70 years old when he passed away. Avram was almost 100 years older than him. So nonetheless, David at this point was at the end of his days. And it begins by saying that they covered him with clothes, but he couldn't get warm. That was part of his malady. However, he was sick or going into his final time, he couldn't stay warm. So his advisors suggested that they find a young woman who would quite literally cuddle with the king and warm him up. Now, here we're going to see that David accepts the proposition, and they look for a beautiful virgin, and they find Avishag HaShunamite. That was her name. Avishag HaShunamite. And apparently, according to the text, she was extremely beautiful. But it makes a point that David did not have relations with her. And part of the explanations is, in those days, a king was allowed 18 wives. And he had 18 wives. And so if he would be with her intimately, he would have to marry her. But if he married her, then he would have too many wives and he would have to divorce one of his other wives. And he didn't want to do that. And therefore, she took care of him and warmed him. But it makes a clear point that he did not know her sexually. And one of the commentaries say that this shows David's humbleness, that even though the whole thing was somewhat problematic, that he didn't want to go against his advisors. He knew they meant the best for him. And so he went along with this, but he did it in a way that it wouldn't cause anyone else pain, that he would have to divorce one of his wives. So that's how the book opens. What's interesting is the whole beginning here of the first chapter. The first chapter is quite long, is actually the Haftorah for the Torah portion of Chayes Sarah. When Chayes Sarah passes away, so this is the Haftorah that was chosen. In the same parsha, we have this verse that I already quoted, Avram Zakein Ba B'Yamim. And later in Chayes Sarah, Avram passes away. So this beginning of the book of Melachim was chosen as the Haftorah for Chayes Sarah. For those who followed the classes last year where we did the weekly Haftorah, we are done with that now. But we went over this first chapter in the context of it being a Haftorah. And then it kind of switches gears, and it says that Adoniyahu, the son of David, his mother was Chagit. He, in English, it says he exalted himself and said, I will rule. Ani amloch. I will rule. Now, again, it's known that David is very sick. We'll say he's on his deathbed, and it's known. But at that point, David had not publicly said who would be the next king. So Adoniyahu, who is the son of one of his wives, Hagit, he took the initiative and he said, Ani amloch, I will rule. And what he did is he made himself a chariot, and he had horsemen, and he had like runners before him. This was considered a very princely thing to do. And he declared, I will be king. And he got a group of people. The text says, it says that David saw that he was acting in this, we'll call it pompous way. And the text says he never rebuked him. You know, this whole idea of acting out as like the prince had already been happening. And it says that David did not rebuke him. And all in one sentence, it says that he was very handsome, and he was born after Avshalom. Now, if we remember, Avshalom was another son of David who rebelled against him and also declared, I will rule. But this is when David was alive and well. Here, it's the people are expecting something to happen here because David is the rumor is he's on his deathbed. So Adoniyahu takes the initiative and he declares himself king. Now, this expression, Ani amloch, I will rule, this is applied to a different concept. And the concept is something that we've discussed many, many times. And that is the idea that before this world, the world of Tikkun, that begins with Bereshit, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There was a previous world. That's why the second verse of the Torah begins, V'ha'oretz hayta tohu v'vohu. And the earth was chaotic and void. That the previous world in Kabbalah is called Olam HaTohu, and the lights of Tohu are tremendous, pure, strong, spiritual, so much so that the individual vessels, and the vessels are the Sfirot, could not contain the light of the world of Tohu, and they shattered. That this is the classic shattering of the vessels. And the shattered vessels, along with the light that was trapped in them, becomes the fabric of this world, the world of Tikkun. Now, the reason I'm mentioning all of this is that what was the problem here? The problem is that each of the Sfirot, and they borrow these words. They also, each of the Sfirot said, Ani Amloch, I will rule. And so the Arizal explains the reason that they all shattered is they all thought, I can handle all the light by myself. I don't need any of the other Sfirot. I will rule. Ani Amloch. So it's just interesting that this is the source of the concept that later the Arizal used these same words for a similar kind of idea. Adoniyahu on his own decides, I will rule. And this is what the Arizal says each of the Sfirot said. I will rule. I don't need the other Sfirot. And part of the world of Tikkun, as described by the Arizal, is that the Sfirot now understand that they have to work together. And this goes deep into the teachings of the Arizal. Excuse me. I have a little cough, so I will be drinking some water during the class. I said a bracha before. So what happens now is that Adoniyahu, so he turned to a number of the people who had been loyal to the king. One of them was Yoav, the general of David's army, who was the son of Tzeruiah. He turned to Eviatar, one of the main priests, and he talked them into following him. Now we're going to see what happens because of that. So here it's complicated because Yoav had been loyal to David his whole life. He did not join Avshalom's rebellion. But as we're going to see as the chapter continues, the relationship between Yoav and David, which we discussed at length at the end of the book of Shmuel, was very complicated. But here Yoav makes it the decision of his lifetime, is he decides to throw his weight behind Adoniyahu. We'll see what happens because of that. And the text says clearly, but the other major priest, Tzadok, and Benayahu, the son of Yehoiada, who in the book of Melachim we're going to see becomes a major figure, and Natan, the prophet, and the main core warriors of David, Adoniyahu did not call. In other words, he understood that what he was doing was problematic. And so he wanted to start with his core group and hopefully garnish enough support, especially from the tribe of Yehuda and the rest of Israel, where it would be a fait accompli, that it's a done deal. It's a done deal. So what happens is he goes, Adoniyahu, to a place called the stone of Chelet. And the commentators say, why did he go to there? And also, it was by a place called Ein Rogel, the spring of Rogel. And the commentaries say is that this place, this stone, was a major hangout for young people. This was remember, this is 3,000 years ago. No pubs, discotheques, no dance, themed places that people go to at 3 a.m. But it was a place where young people hung out. And the Ein Rogel was a spring where many women went and washed their clothes. Of course, they didn't have washing machines. And so they used to wash it in rivers or springs and bring them back home. So that's where he went, and he made this huge feast, and he had them blow shofars and declare Adoniyahu is now the king. So what happens now is that David is unaware of all of this. Perhaps he saw that Adoniyahu was acting in maybe an egotistical, more than a princely manner, but he didn't do anything about it. And I'll just make the comment here. This is what led to Avshalom rebelling as well. If we remember the story of another of his sons, Amnon, who raped Tamar, his half-sister, and who was a sister of Avshalom. Avshalom was outraged. And according to the text, David was also outraged, but he didn't do anything about it. He didn't rebuke him. He didn't punish him. And Avshalom, that's what led ultimately to Avshalom rebelling against David. He could not deal with that the king, his father, allowed this, not he allowed this to happen, but he didn't follow up in any way. And so we see that 2 different times David acts the same way, that when he should have been much stricter with his own children, he wasn't. So what happens now is that the prophet Natan goes to Batsheva. Batsheva, in a certain way, is the main wife of David. We've discussed that. In a few minutes, I want to fill in a little bit more about Batsheva. So if you're noticing, I'm taking a long time on this first chapter because there's really a lot here, and we want to go deep into it. So the prophet goes to Batsheva and says, do you know what's happening here? Do you understand that Adoniyahu has just declared himself king? And you've been expecting this whole time for David to declare that Shlomo, the son of David and Batsheva, would be the king. And so he says to her, it appears you don't know what's happening. We need to do something about this. And so he says, let me give you some advice. You go to David and tell him what's happening and remind him that he promised you that Shlomo would be the next king. And then Natan the Navi says, and as soon as you're done, I'll come in right then and tell the king, do you know what just happened? Adoniyahu just declared himself king. So that was his advice. And it takes a good amount of the chapter, this whole explanation. And then that's exactly what happens. Batsheva goes in and tells him what's happening and reminds him that he has promised to make Shlomo king. And then Natan comes in. Exactly what his advice to her was played itself out. And so the question is, when did David promise Batsheva that Shlomo would be the king? It's not mentioned in the book of Shmuel exactly. So what is like the oral tradition of this promise? And so here I want to speak a little bit about Sheva. We dealt with the whole incident of David and Batsheva, but here I want to go a little bit deeper. We went very deep into who David was, but we didn't go deeply into who Batsheva was. So here I'm going to take the opportunity, because this is a critical point here, is because if David he could decide at this point, I know I promised, but whatever. But that's not what happened. What happens right after this is he declares, I promised, and that's what will be. And we'll see that very day he orchestrates that Shlomo is now coronated king in Yerushalayim, and that we'll get to in a minute. So let's go back a little bit about Batsheva. Batsheva is the granddaughter of Achitophel. If we remember from the book of Shmuel, Achitophel was one of David's not only advisors, but like his Rebbe in a certain way. Achitophel was one of the greatest scholars of the time and commanded tremendous respect. But Achitophel sided with Absalom. And the reason that's brought is very, very simple, is that since Batsheva was his granddaughter, he never really forgave David for the whole incident of David and Batsheva. We're not going to go back over that. But he never really forgave him. He stayed loyal to him until Absalom rebelled. And then he threw his weight behind Absalom. And if we remember, Achitophel, who now expected to be Absalom's main advisor, so he advised him to immediately go after David and kill him while he could. Because if he didn't, David would, he was a great warrior, a great he knew military strategy, and so that was his advice. But Absalom got other advice, which was actually David had planted someone to pretend that they had also thrown their weight behind Absalom, but he was kind of like a spy. And he said, no, don't go immediately after David. David is a seasoned warrior. And when he left, his whole core army went with him. You need a little time to get an army together, and then you can confront David. And so Absalom went with that advice. And when Achitophel heard that, it says, and we learned this, he went home, he put his business in order, he made sure all of his children were taken care of, and he committed suicide. Because he understood, he knew that his advice was the right advice and that it was going to end up in disaster. And when it ended up in disaster, David himself would have had Achitophel killed. So he committed suicide. So that is just where Batsheva is coming from. Now remember, she was married to Uriah Hachiti. Hachiti is one of the Canaanite tribes. So it almost seems that he wasn't even Jewish, but that isn't correct. Not only was he Jewish, but he was considered a very, very holy soul, and which made the whole situation so much more complicated. And so when David goes up to the roof and he sees Batsheva, and again, the sages say that technically she was divorced at the time. And so even though it's clear in the text that God considers that David did not act correctly here, when he called for her and took her, so according to tradition, she agreed, but at the time she said that I will only do this if you promise that our children will become the next kings. And so that's where the promise was given. It's not in the text, but apparently that's when the promise was given that her son would become the king. Now we know that she did get pregnant, but that baby died. And then after Uriah died, he did officially marry Batsheva. She became pregnant and she gave birth to Shlomo. And so this is just the background of chapter 1 when she goes in and says, you promised me that Shlomo would be king. So now is the time to fulfill your promise. And David does. And apparently that was always his intention. So what's interesting is that in the Gemara, it says that David and Batsheva were soulmates from Bereshit. From the inception of the world, they were meant for each other. So this is a very strong statement that they were soulmates from the beginning of time. And in a certain way, like I said, she became his main wife. And we might think, after the whole incident of David and Batsheva, and the baby that she gave birth to died, you might think that David would have said, obviously, this thing wasn't meant to be, and he would have had nothing to do with Batsheva. But it was just the opposite, that in a certain way, in a mysterious way, they really were soulmates. She was his ultimate soulmate, and they stayed together until he died and gave birth to Shlomo, who we will learn about plenty in the book of Kings. And so one of the gematrias, I'm looking at my notes and I don't even remember from who I got this from, but the gematria of Bereshit, when the Chazal, the sages say, David and Batsheva were meant for each other from the time of Bereshit, from the very beginning. And so this phrase, Batsheva LeDavid HaMelech, Batsheva is meant for David HaMelech, that phrase equals exactly Bereshit. So it could be that is the source of why the sages use this idea that they were soulmates from the time of Bereshit. And then this is something else that we did learn at the time, that they were meant for each other. It's just that David should have waited till circumstances would have allowed him to marry Batsheva in a way of less controversy, or the way David went about it. Obviously, God attributed to him a sin, especially the way that it was more, because what the sages say is that technically she was divorced, so it wasn't adultery. But it appears that God was more concerned of the way he had Uriah killed. He didn't do it with, directly, but he orchestrated that Uriah would be in the front lines in a battle that they were going to lose and he would be killed. And apparently that was the deeper sin here. That and even that the sages find a reason why David was it was legitimate for him to do it. Nonetheless, the text makes it very clear that God considered it a sin and that David himself acknowledged that he had done something wrong. And as we said many times, he did tshuva the entire rest of his life for that incident. And from that, he shows all subsequent generations how to do tshuva. But the expression that is used when it's talking about he took her early is achla paga. He ate unripe fruit. In other words, the fruit wasn't ready to be eaten. But this, it's interesting, this phrase is used specifically for fig trees. Because fig trees, the figs are very hard for months and months and months. But when the time for them to become ripe, almost overnight, they become ripe. And then if you don't pick them in the next day or two, the birds will get them or the bugs will get them. And I know this very well because in front of our house for decades, we had this huge fig tree. Unfortunately, it died at a certain point. So it was quite old. But it used to produce literally jars and jars and jars of fig jam. I used to pick the figs every day. You had to pick them every day because if not, they go bad. And my wife would, fill these big pots, and then it would boil down and into fig jam. And my wife used to make bottles and bottles of fig jam we would have for half a year. It was amazing. But what's interesting is we just learned Parshat Bereshit, and Adam and Chava also. The expression is, had they waited until Shabbat, then they could have eaten from both the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But they couldn't wait. They went ahead and they ate achal paga. They ate before the fruit was ripe. And one of the opinions of what kind of a tree it was a fig tree. So that's a deep connection because we know that the name Adam, the Arizal said Adam, the Aleph of Adam is Adam, the first human, who is Adam and Chava at one point together. Dalet is David, and the Mem is Mashiach. Adam, David, Mashiach. So it's a very, very deep connection here of David taking Batsheva. He didn't have the patience and the eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, I said that this promise that David made, some people even say one of the reasons she's called Batsheva, because Sheva literally means like the seventh daughter, or the daughter of seven. But Sheva is the same root as Shavua, a promise. And some say she's actually named Batsheva because of this promise. We know that many people in the Tanakh, in the Bible, their names are not necessarily their real names. They're names that are either given to them because of circumstances. For example, Moshe. We call Moshe Moshe, but we're told that wasn't his Hebrew name. He got the name from Bat Paro, and yet it stuck. And yet the Midrash actually presents 10 different possibilities of his name other than Moshe. And then they say this whole incident with Avishag, the beautiful woman who came to take care of him in his last days, was a tikkun because he didn't have relations with her, and it was consent. She's described as being like extremely beautiful, and the even though he was very, very sick, the commentaries make it clear that had he wanted to have relations with her, he could have, but he chose not to, and it was considered a big tikkun for having taken Batsheva without having that patience. Now, there's an explanation that comes from the Arizal, who explains that Batsheva, why is she called the daughter of seven? Is it's explained she had parts of seven different women before her, and each one contributed a bit to who Batsheva was. And so many say, and the Arizal said, that David and Batsheva are reincarnations of Adam and Chava. So she had a spark of Chava in her, and there they didn't succeed. At the first time around, David and Batsheva did not succeed to fix what Adam and Chava did. Avram and Sarah are considered the first reincarnations. So the Arizal says that also Batsheva, who was a very holy soul, had a spark of Sarah, that the whole idea that she allowed him to be with her was that she had a little bit of prophecy that she was meant to have Shlomo and the next king. So this is very similar to the story of Yehuda and Tamar. Yehuda, Tamar, who has a clear prophecy that she needs to have children. She would have children who would lead to kings in Israel from Yehuda. She was married to Yehuda's sons, and it didn't happen. So she played the harlot and slept with her father-in-law and gave birth to the lineage of David and Melech. And so the Ariz says that the wife of Yehuda was Batsheva, which is very close to Batsheva. And in fact, in the book of Chronicles, at one point, Batsheva is called Batshua. And that's to hint that she also had a spark of the first wife of Yehuda, and also the spark of Tamar, a spark of Ruth, and a spark of David's mother. These are all components of the soul of Batsheva. So if we go back, there are seven women altogether that make up this all-inclusive soul that we call Batsheva. There was Chava, Sarah, Batshua, Tamar, Ruth, Nitzaveh. Nitzaveh is the name of the mother of David, and all of these had a spiritual part of Batsheva. So that's just like an amazing understanding coming from the Arizal. Okay, so now that we've given Batsheva a bit of her due, and like I said, when she agreed to be with David, it was somewhat prophetic. It wasn't just that David saw a beautiful woman. Both of them recognized immediately that they were meant for each other. The first time around, it wasn't totally batikun. So all of this was just to explain on a deeper level, when did David promise Batsheva that her son would become the next king? So now, having done that, so what happens now is that David takes over, and he says to Batsheva, yes, Shlomo will become king. We're doing it right now. And so they went down to, right now it's called the city of David. We have to understand Yerushalayim, the walled city of Yerushalayim as we know it today, was not the original city of David. It was down below. They've done incredible excavations there. Many people have been there. It's open to the public. That was the original city of David. In the city of David, they had to have a water source. And that water source is called the Gihon, or the Mei Hashiloach. And in fact, the famous Hasidic commentary called the Mei Hashiloach comes from that spring. And in the ancient days, we're told that kings were anointed by a stream. And we even saw a beautiful gematria that the word for melech equals 90, and the word for water, mayim, equals 90. And so the idea was that to anoint a king by a flowing stream represented the hope, the blessing that the kingship would flow like forever. And we know that David was promised by God that it would be his lineage that would be the true kings of Israel forever. And so this is the first time, though, that the kingship is being given over. And so David tells the prophet Natan and the high priest Sadok to take the anointing oil, to go down to the Mei Hashiloach, to blow the shofars, excuse me. And it even says that when they blew the shofars and gathered the people, this happened very, very quickly, because remember how many miles away Adoniyahu, who was declaring himself king. And so they did this, and when they blew the shofars, it said the earth shook. It was like so momentous, the blowing of the shofars. And they anointed Shlomo as king. According to tradition, he was 12 years old at the time. As we will see as we continue, he was a very mature 12-year-old. A completely different kind of view of what we might think of a young kid today who's about to get bar mitzvah. So then what happens is the people came, and remember, this is happening in Yerushalayim at the Mei Shiloach, and so it's done. It's done. And so one of the people who is loyal to Adoniyahu, he runs to tell him what's going on. When Adoniyahu sees him coming, he feels he's going to bring good news. but he does not bring good news. He says Shlomo has just been anointed from the king's directive, and the people have accepted him. So Adoniyahu now knows it's over. It's done with. And I want to go back here. Very, very important. In the book of Chronicles, repeats many of the stories of all the books of the Nevi'im that we've been talking about, but especially the life of Shmuel and Shaul and especially David. And it repeats, but it fills in many, many things. And apparently in the book of Chronicles, the prophet Natan already was told by God that Shlomo would be the successor of David. And so the question is asked, so when he goes to Batsheva, why doesn't he just go to David and tell him, this has been revealed already by God? But Natan was afraid that maybe because maybe David or Batsheva had sinned in the meantime, that maybe this would not be fulfilled. But the stories we told tonight, he realizes, no, this is the time, and this is coming from God, that it needs to be Shlomo. And so Adoniyahu also seems to be aware that it was always in the cards that Shlomo would take over. And that's why we could possibly answer, why didn't King David make it more clear? He's on his deathbed. Why didn't he make it clear? But because apparently it was clear. But Adoniyahu was, well, not everyone knows this, and I'm very, very handsome, and I'm the one. Ani amloch, I will rule. That's what a big ego can do to you. And so what happens is that Adoniyahu understands that it's over for him, and he one second. So Adoniyahu now is in tremendous fear of Shlomo. And there was this idea of running to the altar in the Mishkan and holding on to the horns of the Mishkan, as, in other words, as like no one can touch me here. I have safety here. So that's what he did. And Shlomo heard this, and he said to Avshalom, to Adoniyahu, he just said, more or less, I'm using the vernacular, just keep your nose clean, don't pull anything, and you'll be safe. I won't do anything to you, but don't make any trouble. You're forewarned. Do not make any trouble. And so he let Adoniyahu go, which is really, in a certain way, startling, because he immediately could have had him killed for rebelling against the king. He is now the king, and the king has certain rights of justice. And so then that brings us really to the end of chapter 1. And I think that might be a good place to stop. As I said, the opening chapters of the Book of Kings are quite long, very long, lots to it. So I will end before we go on, and I'll just tell you what happens now is the text says that David's days are really at the end now. And he calls in Shlomo, and it has the whole text of how he talks to him and blesses him. That's where we'll start next week. But where I want to end tonight is just a very interesting thing of the how Shlomo was anointed by the Mei Hashiloach. That we already said that it's very symbolic for a king to be made king and anointed by a flowing stream. But here I just want to concentrate just for a few minutes on the idea of anointing. Now, we know, or we should know, that the name Mashiach is not a name of a person. Mashiach literally means the anointed one, the ultimate leader, the ultimate king, who will be anointed as the ruler of the world, as the Mashiach. And Mashiach is like the formal name for the verb of anointing. And so here, because David was promised by God that he would be the king, and for all ages, he was anointed with a Karen, with it was like a shofar, with a horn. Shaul, who was the first king, also was anointed, but not from a horn, from a vessel. And that was significant, which was only understood later. That, and I remember we discussed this at length. Why did there have to be a king before David altogether? Why couldn't things have worked out that David was the first king? So we discussed that in many different perspectives of why Shaul had to be king first. But it was significant that he was anointed, but not with a horn. And so this expression, Karen David, the horn of David, this represents the true lineage of David leading all the ways to the Mashiach. Now, what is he anointed with? That is, it was a special type of olive oil that had different spices in it. It's in the Torah, Parsha Ki Tisa. And when the Kohanim and the Mishkan, the Kohanim and the Levim first were, and when it was first raised up on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, part of all of the ceremony was anointing all of the different vessels and those who would serve in the temple. And so Kohen Gadol's high priests were anointed and kings were anointed. And here we see that who anointed Shlomo? It says Natan and Sadok, the prophet and the high priest together, anointed the king. These are the three, like in a democracy, we have what's called the separation of powers. You have the president or the executive branch, you have the legislative branch, and you have the judicial branch. These are the powers that each one has certain powers that the others don't have. And it's called a balance of power. But this actually, I wrote about this in Orchard of Delights in Parshat Shoftim. This is actually coming from the Torah, that the prophet, the high priest, and the king all had tremendous powers, but they had powers that the others didn't have, and they lacked certain powers that the others had. No one, even the king, had absolute power. And then of course you had the Sanhedrin. You had the legislative. Actually, the Sanhedrin was both the legislative and the judicial. But there were many, many different levels of the Sanhedrin. I'm just pointing out that from this story is we learn the idea of the Navi, the prophet, and the Kohen Gadol coming together and anointing the king. And it's with olive oil and shemen, that's in Hebrew, olive oil is shemen, equals 390, which is 10 times tal. Shemen, tal is dew. And shemen is used throughout Jewish tradition to represent the deeper secrets of the Torah, the anointing oil, the deeper dimensions of the Torah. And one last thing, which is more of an interesting point of Jewish law, and it's very complicated, but it says that a son of a king is not anointed only if there's disagreement at the time of who will become king. Because they asked the question, why was Shlomo anointed at all? He was the son of the king. In a certain way, he should have just automatically become king, and he didn't need anointing. So apparently, later on, there were many kings who were not anointed. They were sons of kings. But here, because there was a disagreement, at the very time that Shlomo is being anointed, Adoniyahu is claiming that he is king. And so, in other words, to establish who the true king is, it needed anointing. The Saadia Gaon, very interesting, brings an opinion that David was the only one who is anointed until Mashiach comes. The other kings were not anointed. That here we see that Shlomo was, that apparently no other kings were anointed, according to Saadia Gaon. That's how he learns it. Anyways, we got to the first chapter of the book of Kings. A lot to follow, a lot to come, but let us again, I want to dedicate the learning tonight to my daughter-in-law's father, whose yahrzeit is tonight, Chaim ben Eliyahu Mendel, and to Lorna Nadine, who needs our prayers right now, and she should have a quick healing.